Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this great webinar. We've got photography post-processing. This is part 2 of a 2-part series, so if you haven't watched the first part, please stick around with us today, but do go watch part 1 later. You can find Intro to Landscape Design Photography Part 1 on our website, just as you can find all of our webinars at landeffects.com/webinars. And we are recording today's webinar as well. We'll have it posted by the end of the day. At the top of your screen, there's some view options where you can exit full screen if you need to. And please use our Q&A section to add your questions. We'll monitor those and make sure you get your answers. So, without further ado, I'll give it over to Paul to take it away.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of the Intro to Photography series. I'm just getting a couple of things set up here real quick. There we are. Okay. So today we'll be working in my favorite program, Photoshop, to show some post-process techniques to enhance your photos. I'll be touching on quite a few different tools today, and I'll do my best to explain them at a pace that is easy to follow. But if I do go too fast, or if something is unclear, please ask me in the Q&A box, and I will do my best to go over it again. Here's the outline for the day. First, we're going to show how to merge multiple photos for an HDR or high dynamic range image. And then we're going to go through that group of photos as one and adjust for tone, color, do some cropping and some lens correction, and then do some final touch-ups and cleaning up of the image. And then finally, we'll save for print and for web. And then we'll move on to a second photo and do a brief enhancement on it, and then add some blur effect for depth of field. So why do we post-process in Photoshop? It allows us to have a lot more control over what we show in the photo. It also allows you to add simple enhancements or change the mood of the photo altogether. But then also, and this is probably the best part, is that it grants you the opportunity to fix issues with the original photo. So if you do something wrong, say your exposure is a little off, or there's a blemish in the photograph, I mean, there's a lot of room for error when you're out in the field shooting, and being able to open up in Photoshop allows you to correct issues such as these. So as you can see here on the right, the upper photo is one I took last year in the Sierra Nevadas, and that's just the raw image. And down below is after post-processing, and you can see that I brought out a lot of the information that was hiding in the shadows, as well as brighten up the colors and improve the contrast. So that's why we post-process. I want to give a little warning right up front. When you do go into post-processing, it's easy to overdo it. We don't want to do what I've done with this photo here and just make it look awful. It's way too much color. It's way oversaturated. It's, the vignette is extreme. It looks like an Instagram filter. So try to be careful with that, especially when doing landscape photography. You kind of want to go for more of a realistic representation of what the site or space is. So in our first example, like I said, we'll be going over combining some photos for high dynamic range. And all that means is that you have a lot more range in the tonal values of your image. So if you have two photos, one that's a little overexposed and one that's a little underexposed, you can bring out the information that may be hiding in the underexposed shadows, as well as the information that could be hiding in the overexposed highlights. So you get the best of over and underexposing when you combine photos like this. And the point of having an HDR is to present a similar range of luminance that is experienced through the human eye, since our eyes adjust to different light levels automatically. So this is going to be the first two images that we're working with. I'm going to combine these. I took these earlier this week, and I was actually just holding the camera by hand. And the image on the left is underexposed, but I do have the information of the sky. It's not washed out, as well as the information that's being reflected off the window on the right. So I kind of want to grab that information from the photo on the left, but then on the right, notice that I've brightened it up and overexposed the sky, but now I actually get some details of what's actually going on in the places that are a little bit darker within the image. So by combining these, we should be able to come out with something a little more like this. And then we'll move on to a second photo, which is a little bit better exposed for what I wanted. And so we're gonna spend less time actually augmenting the color and the adjustments. We're gonna let Photoshop just handle a lot of that. But then I wanna show how to add depth of field in post-process in case you wanted to add that blur or bokeh effect, and you didn't do it while shooting the photo in the first place. So let's get to it. Exit out of here. Go into Photoshop. So for our first example, we want to bring the photos together. And you can do this manually, but I don't suggest it because it's a pain, especially if you aren't using a tripod, or even if you are using a tripod, it's easy to move the camera ever so slightly between changing your exposures. And then when you open up the photo, it's not going to line up exactly, so that you have to go through and tweak them. But what you can do is if you go to File, Automate, and Merge to HDR Pro, and it'll bring up a dialog box here in which you can browse for the photos that you want to combine in your HDR. So I'm just going to select these two photos here. Click Open. If you have more than two files, and actually I would recommend using at least 3 for a really good HDR type of photo. You can split those up and put them into a folder and actually browse to the folder and just select that. And so once you have them selected, make sure you have this checked to attempt to automatically align the source images. That way Photoshop does the sizing and lining up of the photos automatically. And then just click OK. And it's going to think for a bit and process and do what it needs to do to line up those photos. And then it'll bring up this box here, giving you some options on what you want to do with your photos. If you have the modes set to 16-bit or even 8-bit, you can adjust the tones details here and then open it up in Photoshop. I recommend actually switching it to 32-bit. That just means that you have a lot more information per pixel. And then check the complete toning in Adobe Camera Raw. We're going to be working a lot in the ACR or Adobe Camera Raw today. So let's just leave it at 32-bit. That way we have the most amount of information to work with and basically start toning from scratch. Okay, once Photoshop is done processing, you'll have your Camera Raw settings. So this is the photo, the two photos combined. And straight off the bat, before adjusting anything, I'll go to auto and I'll click that and just see what it gives me. Sometimes automatic adjustments, it doesn't quite get me what I want, but it's for the most part, it's a good starting point. So by clicking auto, it's going to do its best to adjust these sliders to get decent highlights, exposure, and make the photo as good as it can be based on its own processes. So I'll start there. And actually, I did a pretty good job of lightening up the sky. But once I hit auto, I like to take a step back and then kind of plan out what I want to do with the photo. In landscape photography especially, it seems to be an everlasting battle between the brightness of the sky and how dark the ground is. And so getting these two tonal values to sort of even out is one of the biggest goals and challenges that I come across when it comes to any kind of landscape photography. And so when I take a step back and I look at this, I see that I want to keep the sky basically how it is. I could brighten up a little bit, but it's really these areas here, very dark in shadow, and sort of muted colors here in the midground and foregrounds, and this is very dark. So let's start adjusting just these areas to match up with the luminance of the sky. To begin, I'm going to show the graduated filter tool, which is this tool here, or you could just press the G key. And you'll notice it changed the sliders over here a little bit, and it's set to new, and graduated filter is open. So I can drag basically a gradient across, ending about here. I just want to cover the majority of where the shadows are. And now everything that is in this graduated filter area can be adjusted separately than the rest of the photo. So I kind of want to just go through and add some graduated filters and just brighten up some of these darker elements. So maybe I'll add another one here. Just drag it all the way up. If you hold down the shift key, you get a nice straight line. And maybe one over here. This one, I didn't quite stretch out far enough. And if you once you have your gradients or your graduated filters set, you can head over to these sliders and adjust them, or whichever one's selected. So that was actually a little too exposed. So I want to drop that down just a tad. And so I'm only working with exposure at the moment. A lot of these other sliders, I kind of like to hit the entire image at once with these. And so I'll get to those in just a bit. I'm trying to, at this point, just get a good exposure to the entire photograph. So that's already looking a lot better. If I click over to my magnifying glass, I'm going to jump out of the graduated filter options. And now taking a look at this, I notice there's just this area up here I want to brighten up a little bit, and maybe in here, just anywhere where it's just a little bit dark, I can use the adjustment brush, and that's going to give me a brush tool. If you go down to the bottom of these sliders here, you can change how the brush is used. You can change the size, the feather, which is just the distance between the actual brush itself and how it feathers out and mixes with the rest of the drawing, and the flow. And I like to leave the flow at about 40 and have a nice feather to it. And you can use the bracket keys on your keyboard, just like the brush tool in Photoshop, to enlarge or make smaller. And I'll click on it, it'll drop a pin in, and then just start brushing some of these darker areas. And if you're having trouble seeing what you're actually brushing, go ahead and bring your exposure up all the way, or you could bring it down, just so you know where exactly you are brushing. So I know I just want to hit these little spots. Maybe this guy, because he's kind of the center of attention. And then bring the exposure up. And see, I did go into the sky a bit here, so I'm just going to click on the erase and just remove where I overpainted. Okay, and now I just want to add a little bit more to this here. And then I'll actually create a new brush and just hit a couple of these slightly darker areas, but I don't want to overexpose those. So you just click on new on the adjustment brush and drag the exposure down just a bit. And I want to have a very, very nice gradual adjustment here. So I'm going to up the feather a lot and actually take the flow down a bit. Okay, just minor touch-ups. All right, we're looking good. The value of the sky is no longer way higher than what is on the ground. We're getting a nice even looking image here. So once we've adjusted all the tones, let's go into color. Let's go out of our brush tool and move down. What I like to do typically is up the clarity, which kind of adds like some nice contrast to the image. Usually between 25 and 50% is where I'll stick with that. But when it comes to adding color to landscape shots, I typically don't like to add saturation. It seems to be a little too much, so I'll leave that close to 0. But I'll bring the vibrance up about 20 to 30%. Okay, you notice we have some dark spots along the sky here. I'll fix those when we actually go into the regular Photoshop tools. So the color's looking okay. Maybe we're not quite there yet, but I'm going to move on. Use your magnifying glass to zoom in and see how noisy your image is. If you zoom into 100% and you start to see a lot of this noise, head over to the sharpening tools here and click on noise reduction. And that'll help bring that down. You don't want to use too much of it because it'll give it kind of a plastic look to it. We actually don't need it for this photo. Also, you can adjust the sharpening if things are a little too blurry for your taste. But I think we're looking good for now. I'm going to click OK to go into our Photoshop workspace here. And so what I want to do at this point is actually crop the image. Notice that the vertical lines, at least in the center, are not straight up and down, and the composition isn't that great. So I'm going to try to fix that the best I can. If you don't have your rulers up on the borders here, head up to View and click on Rulers. That'll show the rulers here, and then what you can do is you can actually click on them and drag them over, and it gives you these guiding lines, which are really great for lining up vertical elements in your image. So with pretty much any camera lens you use, there's going to be some kind of distortion in basically the curvature of the lens will cause elements on the sides, such as this wall here and over here, to sort of bend around, and that's just because a lens is curved, and so it's distorting the image as it comes in. But when we go to crop and straighten our image, we want to focus on straightening out elements that are in the middle, and then we can worry about these distortions on the side later. That is, of course, unless you get a tilt shift camera lens, which is a really expensive, awesome lens for shooting architecture, in which it will give you straight lines throughout the photo. So now I hit the C key to crop, or click on this button over here. And I'm just going to grab the corner here with the curved arrows and rotate it. And I'm going to rotate it until the vertical lines of this elevator shaft match up with the guidelines that I've put. So now these lines here are fairly vertical. And then I'm going to bring the photo in just a bit, maybe about here. And I'm holding down the shift key to retain the aspect ratio of the photo itself. And I'll just bring this down just so that most of the sky is in that upper third of the image. Okay, and to remove, or not remove, but hide your guidelines, hit Control and the colon key, or Command colon. It's a quick way to hide and unhide your guidelines there. But now I want to adjust for these vertical lines on the sides here. I want them to be just as vertical as the lines in the middle. And so there's a couple ways you can do this. One way, which is a quick way if it works, but it doesn't always work, is to just go up to the filter and click on lens correction. And this is a neat tool here in which you can, if you have your auto correction selected, you can actually go through and choose what camera you use and also what lens model you have. And more than likely, it's going to have your lens model in here, even if it doesn't have your exact camera model. And so I've already done that, and here's the camera lens that I was using. And sometimes it works. Sometimes it'll adjust the image and make everything straight. And it did make it pretty straight. But more often than not, I've noticed it doesn't quite do the job, in which case you can go to custom and stick pretty much to the remove geometric distortion and either add kind of a bulge effect or take that away. Just like that. And so the goal here is to just get these lines, even if they're not totally vertical, just to be straight, because we can transform after we get out of here. So once you have your lines here looking pretty straight, I can now make a copy of this layer. I'm just going to use Command or Control J. And then Command or Control T to open up our transform controls. It's going to give you these grip points and allow you to transform the image. And I'm just going to right click in the middle somewhere and click on Distort. And what that allows you to do is grab one of these grip points and adjust it without, with the other three corners being anchored. And so I just want to grab this one here, hold down the shift key and pull it out ever so slightly so that this line here is vertical. And remember to use guidelines to help you line up these vertical elements. Okay. So I'm just going to adjust these upper two corners until everything is more or less fairly vertical. Be careful when doing transformation controls on especially photographs. It's easy to go overboard and have a really warped looking image there. If you are trying to get rid of, say, a curve and you don't use the lens correction to straighten out some of these lines, open your control commands and then go into warp, which allows you to grab different points on the image and move them. But this is even more dangerous as you can really start to dig yourself into a hole of too many curves within your image. So we don't need to do that for this one. Okay. So now that we have our tones more or less where we want them to be and the color pretty close to what we're looking for here in this photo, I am noticing that there is a drain here with some water stains around it. If I zoom in with Control or Command plus, I notice there's some leaf litter, some calcium buildup. It looks like grass is poking through the concrete here. And then there's also some cracks, some stress cracks in the concrete itself, as well as in the building. So if you don't have the opportunity to take a picture of your site after it was just installed, or if it wasn't cleaned up to a pristine condition, you can go through and actually take out a lot of these elements. The first thing I'll do when cleaning up stuff like this, if it's just little isolated blemishes and things like this, just head up to your healing brush tool, or rather the spot healing brush tool. And I'm actually going to make a new layer and call it touch-ups. And that is just in case I go a little too far and I need to revert back to where I was when I started, which is easy to do when you're doing touch-ups. But I'm basically got my spot healing brush tool. I'm going to make the brush about this big and just draw over these little blips that I want to remove. So it looks like this might be gum on the concrete. And if there's a crack in the concrete, I can click here, hold down the shift key and click on the other side. And it's going to do its best to remove these little spots. This is a great tool for minor little details like this. So I'm just going to go through and remove some of these items on the ground here. Real easy. Now for these bigger items, let's go to the stain around the drain. Always zoom in when you're working on detailed objects like this. It's going to make your life a whole lot easier. I want to remove this, and there's a couple ways you can do this, but I like to start off using this technique where I'll make a selection of the items to be removed. And since there are joints in the concrete here that I want to leave as details in the photo, I want to make some selections using my polygonal lasso tool, just of the stain parts and some areas around it, but making sure to leave out the joints in the concrete. And for this example, I actually don't mind that. Oh, let's make sure we're adding to the selection. I don't mind that I'm removing the drain. So I'm just going to select that as well. So once we have our areas to be fixed, selected, I'm just going to hit I'm going to hit the Shift key, hold that down, and then hit the F5 key. That's going to bring up my fill options. And so in here, you want to make sure you have content aware selected, color adaptation, and then leave everything else as it is, and click OK. And Photoshop is going to work some magic and actually go through and fill in these selected areas, keeping in mind the areas that are around it, and try to process it. And sometimes this doesn't work, but sometimes it does. So it's always good to start with that. If it doesn't work, then you want to go through and actually adjust further. So it did a pretty good job, but you can still tell that it has been photoshopped. So I'll actually go in, and now I'm going to use my patch tool, which is another really neat tool that allows you to make a selection around an area. And then once that selection is made, click in the middle of it and drag your marching ants over to an area that you want to sort of replicate the pattern of, and then unclick. And it's going to sort of match the pattern in this area over the area that you have selected. And for more precise selections, use your lasso tools here. And of course, if you have some things that are selected within the marching ants, like the joint here, it could throw off how this is processed. So let's just wrap this up real quick. That's pretty good. Certainly you can spend some more time adjusting this. Another neat tool for this is the healing brush tool or the clone stamp tool. And the clone stamp tool allows you to select an area holding the Alt key as sort of a reference point, and then allows you to draw over another area, and it's going to replicate that first area that you chose as reference. So we can just kind of touch this up, make it look a little more natural. And then I'm just going to use the patch tool on these cracks. And also this calcium buildup. So just very quickly make some selections. One thing about post-processing that I've learned from talking with some of my photographer friends, and also just scouring the internet for information, a lot of professional photographers spend way more time in post-process than they do actually taking photos. But of course, that is subjective. Not everybody is that way, but certainly you can spend a lot of time adjusting very minute details during the post-process. And unfortunately, we don't have that much time to really go into it, but that looks good enough for now. So we'll quickly move through this part here. One thing that you might come across when doing photo merging is this sort of look here, which is kind of a glow effect, also known as a ghost effect. And depending on the situation, you probably want to address it. This is going to be easy to address as there's a sky behind it, and honestly, we don't really need these flowers in the foreground. So I'm just going to remove this altogether using the techniques that we just went over. Just make a very quick selection around the elements I don't want. That's fine. And maybe I'll use the healing brush tool, which works a lot like the clone stamp tool where you hold Alt to choose an area of reference. But it's a little more intelligent on blending the source information with the stuff that you're covering up. So let's just wrap this up real quick. Of course, use a soft brush if you want to, whoop, not the tool. Use a soft brush if you want to blend a little more smoothly. So let's go here. And actually, I did over step my boundaries on the sky here entirely, so we should probably address this dark area. But then there's also a little bit of a glow here on the edge that I want to get rid of. In order to do that, we want to use the quick selection tool. Make sure that auto enhance is on. And then make a selection here. And we want to keep these in photo. Sometimes it doesn't work so great. Okay, well, let's just zoom in real quick and fix this. But essentially, you want some clean selections of the areas that you are working with. Okay, that's good enough. So you just want to lighten up this area here. And we can basically just use this area in the middle as reference. And go back to our clone stamp tool. Get a nice big selection going. Out here. And just kind of blend that in. And of course, if we go a little over our boundaries here, we can mask out some things like this. Oop. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this. But let's just fix this little mistake here. Oh, well, yep, let's move on. Certainly I can fix that, but we're running out of time here. So once we go through touch-ups, which can be a painstakingly intensive process, we want to now check out our levels, and we're actually looking good here. When looking at a histogram, it's basically a graph of the different tones in your drawing or in your image. And the goal here is usually to have the values drop as they approach true black or true white. How this works is on the left, you have your 0% light, which is just black, and 100% light on the right. And so you want the majority of your information to kind of represent sort of a bell curve here. That way it's all well lit. If the graph runs into the black and there's a lot of stuff in the black, that means that there's a lot of information hiding within the black values of the photo. You know, and this can really depend on what effect you're going for in your photo, but typically for landscape, you want to have a good amount of mid-tones and only just a hair of true black and true white, if any. So when I'm preparing to finish a photo, make sure everything's on this layer, I'll go into Camera Raw filter one more time. I might try clicking on auto, see what it does. Sometimes it helps a little bit. I want to just add a little more vibrance to this one. Maybe a tad more clarity. And just go through and make sure that it's where you want it to be. And then, like I do with a lot of my photos, I'll add a little bit of vignette just to bring your eye into the image itself so it's not wandering off on the sides. I try not to go over 25 or negative 25 on the vignette, but somewhere around here just to give it a little more appeal and draw your eye in. And then you can, of course, adjust the roundness, and I'll bring up the feather a bit as well. Click OK. And now when you're done and you want to save it, depending on what you're doing, you'll have different options for saving it. Certainly save the PSD so that you can come back and adjust some of these items in Photoshop. But if you're saving it for print, you'll want to make sure to go to Save As and either save it as a TIFF. The TIFF format is going to be optimal. It's going to keep the most amount of information in the image. When you send it off to the printer, the flip side of that is that it's going to give you a very large file size. So it's not great for if you're trying to cut down on that. The second option is PNG. It's also pretty good at maintaining a lot of that image information without compressing it too much. So leave it at full size and then save it as a large file size, TIFF or PNG for print. But if you're trying to optimize this for web, you'll want to actually drop the image size by going to Image, Image Size. And for the image size on web, you want to have your resolution set to 72. And then you'll want to adjust the actual size of the image based on what you're using it for. I was told by our webmaster here that pop-ups or large images stay around 1500 pixels wide. Or if you're going for full screen background images, you want to have a maximum of 2560 pixels in width. So this is actually a pretty good size for web. And if you're optimizing for high resolution monitors, you'll just want to double the actual size of the image, not the resolution. So once you resize the image, click OK. Hopefully you've saved the PSD so you didn't just shrink your image. And then you'll want to go down to Export and Save for Web. And this will give you lots of different options, but you'll want to change your presets to JPEG, either medium or high, JPEG option, and then click Save. And typically you'll want more or less a 500 kilobyte image. But again, that's based on what size you are actually needing to use. So now that we've gone through merging two not so great photos together to make one that's somewhat usable, I want to show what it's like to work with a photo that is appropriately exposed, at least for the parts of it that I'm using. And that's this photo here. There is some overexposure in the sky up here, but I'm going to crop that out. The focus is this little planter here. So I'll open it up in Camera Raw, and I'll just click on this auto setting. Does a pretty good job of adjusting the tones and everything for that. I do want to up the clarity just a bit, the vibrance, and then also the exposure just a little bit. And then I'll typically up the blacks and the shadows and drop the whites and the highlights. And I'll just zoom in to see how clear it is, and maybe just add a bit of sharpening. Okay, and now I'm just going to open the image. And you'll notice when you open an image from Camera Raw, it's going to open it up as a smart object. That's what this little symbol here in your layers represents. And that just means that you can double click on here, go back to your Camera Raw settings, and they'll still be where they were before. So you're not affecting the source image. Now, what I wanted to show with this is that depth of field effect using iris blur. So first things first, let's crop the image. And using my rule of thirds, I'm going to have basically these first few plants as sort of the focus, which is where these two lines intersect here. Right about there. And I'm just going to straighten out the vertical on the right a little bit. And also take out that sky that was overexposed. And now I'm going to make a copy of my layer here. And to get the depth of field, there's quite a few different blur options, but the one I like to use for this application is if you go to Filter, Blur Gallery, and click on Iris Blur. And Iris Blur is a pretty solid blur tool. In the middle, you have a pin. This pin is going to be your point of focus. So wherever you place that pin, it's going to be completely in focus or not blurry at all. And then you have these different grip points and a boundary. Basically what these grip points are, if you click on them, there's 4 of them, they'll move in unison in relation to the pin. And what they are is they designate the beginning of the gradient of blur. So if I want just a very small area focus and a lot of gradient or gradual blur, I would stretch out the boundary. The boundary is just going to be where it's the absolute blurriest. And this is where that gradient starts. So what I'm trying to achieve here is to make this area in focus and blur out the rest of it. So the point that's, or points that are going to be the most blurry is everything back here. And I want the gradient to start about here. Now, if I hold the Option or the Alt key, I can move each one of these individually. And same if I grab my boundary grip here, I can change the rotation and the width or height of the boundary. And then there's one more grip point here, which is a diamond, which allows you to grab and change the shape from very circular to more rectangular. So for this, I want to actually make this circular, like so. Put my focus right here and drag out just make some adjustments so that the blur is good. There's a wheel here that allows you to add more blur or take away the blur. So I want kind of an extreme blur here. Okay. Once we have this main area in focus, we can now, if we click anywhere else in the drawing, we'll create a second pin, which is going to allow you to fix some of the issues with that circle that we had. Basically, I kind of want this whole area in focus, which would mean that this part of the sidewalk would also be in focus. So I need to adjust for that to make it look a little more natural looking. So I'm going to change my shape to a rectangular, stretch it out. Like so, and maybe just adjust it. So there's a little bit blur as things are coming a little closer to the camera. And then this sort of 4 mid-ground area is going to be all in focus, and then very little focus as we extend to the background. And once we're good, just hit enter. And now we've created a false depth of field. And so once you're ready to go, do your final adjustments. Again, I always like to put on at least a little vignette just to bring the eye in and frame the image. And maybe just a little more clarity, vibrance. And then we're good. We have a few minutes here. I'd like to take any questions, or if you'd like me to go over anything again real quick.
Yeah, Julie asked a great question regarding some of the touch-up stuff you were doing earlier. She was thinking or asking, Would it be best to apply the lens correction before you crop?
It depends. Certainly you can, especially if you're going to use one of the presets. I would actually recommend doing that because it's going to take the information from that it knows your lens is going to produce and straighten it from there. And so if we had done that, we would have had no warping on the sides, or ideally no warping on the sides, and then you could crop and adjust and have straight lines from the get-go. I've noticed in the past that you might not quite get perfect vertical lines doing that, so you'd still have to do a little bit of transformation, but certainly that's probably actually a better workflow than cropping first.
Yeah, and that seemed to be the extent of the questions.
Okay. Well, I suppose that's it then. I hope you all have a lovely weekend. And of course, this will be posted on Monday. The recorded version will be, at least. And if you have any further questions on that, please direct those to.
Oh,
go ahead.
Hall, if you got a minute, we did have one more question pop in.
Okay.
Could you talk about best practices, more what not to do? The first part where you were talking about the image being oversaturated.
Oh, okay. So I showed this image on one of the first few slides. It's back up to a full version. Yeah, so right away, if you go in your raw filter, and there's a lot of different sliders and things that do a lot of the same things, but certainly you don't want to bring your saturation up to that. It looks very kind of cartoony and fake. So just being a little aware of how much you're actually affecting the drawing. But then again, there's also what is your intention? I mean, are you trying to create more of a fantastical look, something that looks like it's out of maybe the late 60s? You know, that could be an artistic direction for you. I don't think you should stay away from things just but for typically for a lot of these landscape images, it's yeah, you want to just don't overdo it. The real goal is for a lot of landscape photography is to bring out how the site makes you feel and give it a fair representation of what it is. And so you don't want to, you know, create this super cartoony look typically. So a lot of times when I'm working in Camera Raw and I'm making these adjustments, I'll go through almost every slider and I'll just do little bits here and there just to kind of see how it works. If it helps, if it enhances the photo and gets me on the path to what I'm trying to achieve, then I'll keep it. If not, I'll just go back to 0. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but for a really good HDR photo, I didn't do quite what you're supposed to do for a really good HDR. I was more showing how if you have two sort of poorly exposed photos, you can put them together. Typically for HDR, you'd want to have at least 3. You'll want to have one that is perfectly exposed, a photo that you would probably use on its own. And then you do want to have a photo that has, what is it? It's about 2, just a little bit underexposed and just a little bit overexposed. So that way you have a range of just a little bit underexposed, but you still get the good highlight information, something that's perfectly exposed, and then also something that's just a little overexposed for a good range. If you can, do 4 or 5 different images in a nice gradient of really underexposed to completely overexposed.
And one last question. I know we're out of time, but Martin Rodriguez is wondering what the big benefit on using Photoshop over Lightroom. More of a question of practicality and time.
Okay. So I've used Lightroom a bit too. And I debated whether or not I should actually show Lightroom in this one because it is about just as popular in the photography world for enhancing photos. And the reason I showed Photoshop is because of the ACR setup here. It's almost exactly like Lightroom. The difference that I've noticed, the big difference in Lightroom, is that you can set up all of your settings and they'll be saved into a profile. And then you can batch those exact settings onto mini photographs. So if you do a photo shoot and you're using the same settings on your camera the whole time, you can then import all of those photos at once and apply all of the same effects to all of those photos. So in that case, you can save a lot of time in post-process. But the reason I showed Photoshop is just because a lot of these controls and how this is set up is very, very similar to how Lightroom is set up.
Cool. I think that's it.
Alrighty. Happy Friday, everybody, and have a good weekend.